All right, welcome everyone. I'm Shane Rose. I'll be your presenter today. I'm a technical trainer here at InterSystems, focusing on cache and ensemble topics. And today we're going to talk about the InterSystems authorization schema, specifically talking about securing the management portal. I'm here today with Michael Brady, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello everybody, my name is Michael Brady. I'm also a technical trainer here at InterSystems. I'll be compiling questions that are sent into the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Michael. So like Michael said, he'll be compiling any questions you have. So I'm going to give a presentation here. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A section, and please make sure you send it to all panelists. And Michael will aggregate those questions along the way to be answered at the end. Also, it'd be helpful if you could type your full question in one message. That'll just help him be able to track who asked what and be able to respond appropriately. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about the authorization schema. So whenever we talk about authorization in terms of security, it's part of two pieces, which is authentication and authorization. Authentication is proving that you are who you say you are to the system, so usually by knowing the password. So we're going to not talk about that part today, but instead focus on what happens afterwards, which is authorization. Essentially, what privileges do you have in the system once you've logged in? Now, it's important to consider authorization for a couple reasons. The first and most obvious one is to make sure you do not have unauthorized access, as in people who shouldn't be allowed on the system performing activities they should not be allowed to. Another reason you want to consider this is so that people who do have access don't accidentally do something they shouldn't do. So whenever you're in the management portal, you're dealing with the live data, potentially. You're dealing with important memory settings. If you're using Ensemble, you could be manipulating data transformations, the messages, the productions. You want to make sure that people don't do something, maybe even accidentally, that they shouldn't be allowed to do. So whenever we talk about authorization, there's a lot of terms. So typically when we teach this, we talk about the sentence, which walks you through the authorization schema. And I have it at the top here, and it's that users are members of roles granting permissions on resources protecting assets. Okay? In order for somebody to have access to the system, they basically have to make it from the first part of the sentence to the last part of the sentence. Okay? So a user in the system has a definition, basically their username and password, and the assets are the things that need protecting in the system. Those things include connections through CSP, which would be the management portal, specific pages in the management portal, as well as the databases themselves. Okay? So assets are things that need protection. Users are the people accessing the system. So the first and last parts of the sentences are probably the easiest to grasp. And a user needs to have the appropriate privileges on those assets that he or she needs in order to do anything interesting in the system. Okay? Now, the middle part is where it gets interesting. Users are members of roles. What a role is a named collection of privileges. So you might have a role for monitor users, or you might have a role for developers, or a role for managers, or a role for operators. So it's a named collection of privileges that you want to be able to give to many users to have different levels of access in the system. Okay? So a role is nothing but a name and then comprising a set of privileges. Now the privileges are the permissions on the resources in the sentence here. So the resources are each assigned to some sort of asset in the system that they're protecting. So for example, in Ensemble, we have the ENS demo namespace. It's just one of the sample databases that has some sample data transformations, rules, productions. Well, it has the name ENS demo. It's being protected by a resource called %db_ENS demo. So that resource has been assigned to protect that database, and a user must have that resource in their role. Now, the other part of the privilege is the permission. The permissions there's only three of them. They're read, write, and use. Read and write are typically used for databases, although we'll see in parts of the management portal, it might be important to give read or write access to some other things, but usually a lot of times it's the databases. And use is more generic, and it just says you have permissions on this resource to maybe be able to access certain pages in the management portal. Okay. So roles are a named collection of privileges. A user is made a member of that role. They have that set of privileges. So for example, they can use CSP connections. They can connect via CSP. They can use different pages in the management portal. And they can read and write to a database. So a user is made a member of the role that gives access to these assets. Now, a couple things here. A user is never given a resource directly. You never assign a privilege directly to a user. You always assign the resource to the role and then make a user a member of the role. Now, this just makes your life easier. You have a set of actions that monitor users should have to perform, or a set of actions that developers should have to perform. So you just define what those privileges and actions are, and then you make your users members of that role. Also, a user can be a member of many roles, doesn't just have to be a member of one. If a user is a member of multiple roles, they just get the union of all the privileges across all those roles. And you never have to worry about privileges canceling each other out. Privileges always give access. You don't have to worry about one role giving one permission and another role restricting that same privilege. That's not a thing in this security. Okay? Privileges are always giving access. To restrict access is to just not give the privilege. Okay, so once again, users are members of roles, granting permissions on resources, protecting assets. Assets are the things that need protection in the system, typically the services, the ways you can connect, like CSP, different pieces of code, like pages in the management portal, and also the databases. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of this. I'm going to create a user and a role and add some privileges to that role and show what the user can see in the management portal. And then I'll get more into some Ensemble topics, because the different Ensemble pages in the management portal are pretty interesting as far as what privileges you need to be able to perform various activities. All right, so here I'm logged into the management portal. So this is the front page here. And now for the demonstration here, I'm going to bounce back and forth between two different browsers. I'm in Firefox right now. I'm just going to stay logged in here as a user named srose that just has all the privileges, can do everything. So I'm going to use this browser to set up my security. And then I'm going to switch over to Safari whenever I actually have a user that I want to log in as to show what they can see. So I'm going to move back and forth between these browsers. So a couple things here about the management portal. To set up users and roles, you do that under the system administration security menus. In here you have users, roles, resources, all those things, some of those things we saw in the sentence. This is where you can go to create a new user, make a new role, assign the user to the role, make new resources to be put into the roles. So that's where you can do those. But before I show those activities, I just want to show something in the management portal it's not always the most clear. If you go to a page in the portal and hover over the name of the page and click on that, it takes you directly to the page. However, if you go to that page and click off to the right-hand side of this button here, not directly on the words, it brings up this additional panel here where you can see the resource protecting this page. So back to the sentence, the system dashboard could be considered an asset in the system. You may want to restrict who can see what, various pages, including the system dashboard. So here we can see that you need admin manage to be able to, admin operate in order to access this page. So you need that in your role to see the system dashboard. Okay. Now I'm going to return to the security portion. So back under security, I'm going to quickly just make a new user for us here. There's the predefined users in the system, but to make a new user, they require a name and a password. Okay. Now there's various ways to authenticate users. I'm not going to go into that here. I'm just going to focus on regular cache users, username and password. When you have a new user in the system, they by default have no roles. So if I move over to this roles tab, Shane is a member of no roles, therefore has no privileges in the system. Okay, so he cannot do anything yet. Now, I want to give Shane some level of access to the management portal. Maybe I want to give Shane access to just the system operation pages in the portal. This includes like the system dashboard, maybe being able to manage some of the processes, mount and dismount databases, but restrict access to the System Explorer parts of the menu of the management portal where you can actually see data and execute SQL statements. We want to lock that down and not give Shane access. Likewise, system administration is a lot of settings, a lot of memory settings. You may also want to restrict that. So if you have some monitor user who needs a little bit of access to the system just to see what's going on, being able to look at the dashboard and the logs and the processes, you might just want to give access to the system operation menu. So if I return to the security page and go to roles, I can see all of the default roles in the system. So these are the ones that come out of the box. There's a lot here. There's some pre-built Ensemble roles that you can use as a starting point, and I'll go over more of those later. There's some roles that give various levels of access to the more cache parts of the management portal, like manager, operator. However, at the top, there's a role called %all. This is a special role. You can notice there's no delete button next to it. It's one that has to stay in the system. It's marked here as the super user role. It always gives all privileges in the system. So it's exactly what the name says. It gives you all the privileges. So even if you make a new resource, the %all role gives access. So your main people who manage the system will probably have %all. But you may not want everybody to have access to this. So I want to do a poll question here. The first poll question, so we'll bring that up. And it's, do you have support personnel who need to have access to the management portal but should not have %all? So you might have some support or help desk folks. You might have some consultants that should only have some level of access. Do you have these a need of a variety levels of access to the management portal? Okay, results coming in. Okay, and it looks like most people have said yes, so this presentation is exactly for you. 21 of 49 said yes. Some people said no, so this might be just more informational for you guys. Or maybe you want to set this up more in the future. So you want to be able to give different levels of access. It's not good for everybody to just have %all and hope that nothing goes wrong. You want to restrict people's levels of access and also make sure that they don't make a mistake or anything in the system. So on this page here, I can create a new role. And I'm going to make one similar to what I had up on the board. I'm going to call it monitor. And just like it says, it's for some operators to be able to go on and see like the system dashboard and also be able to see some of the logs and processes and things like that. And then later on, I'll extend it to give some of the monitoring privileges for Ensemble as well. But right now, role requires a name. Once it's been named, I can add these privileges, which, remember, privileges are the combination of a permission on a resource. So in order to be able to do anything interesting in the system, you have to be able to connect, perform some sort of code and some sort of application. In our case, that's the management portal. And you have to be able to access at least one database. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new privilege. And I'm going to give a privilege called %service console. Or excuse me, %service CSP. Service CSP protects connections via the CSP gateway. So any of your CSP applications or Zen applications coming through the CSP gateway, users will have to have use on service CSP. Now, resources can be marked as public. And this one is actually marked as public already, so it's as if every user had it. But I'm just going to include it for completeness sake. So this is one of the services. The services are the connections into the system. You can connect via CSP. You can connect via the terminal. And this is just one of those connections. I'm also going to add the admin operate privilege that we saw earlier whenever I was looking at other pages in the management portal, like the system dashboard. This use on admin operate will give me the ability to look at that page. However, that page, like the system dashboard, contains information that's stored in a cache database. That cache database is cache sys. So a lot of the information on those pages in system operations are coming from the cache sys database, so I'm going to give permissions on that. Okay. So now that I've created my monitor role here, use on admin operate, use on service CSP, and read write on cache sys, go ahead and save that. And now this role exists, but it needs to now be actually assigned to somebody. I can move over to the Members tab and find Shane, the user I just made a moment ago, and assign that to him. So Shane is now a member of the monitor role. If I move over to Safari here and log in as Shane, we see the management portal like we saw it with my super user. However, if you notice, a lot of the menus are grayed out here. I only have access to system operation. I can get to the system dashboard and see those statistics. I can look at the logs. I can look at the console log. And I can see the processes. Okay. So I've given this user access to the system operation pages, but he cannot see the data directly in the databases. He can't make changes to configuration settings. But what if you want further granularity here? Maybe I don't want some users who should be able to see the system dashboard and the databases page. Maybe I don't want those users to have access to the processes page. So from the processes page here, I can examine jobs. I could even terminate a job. Maybe I don't want to give that power to certain users. So what I can do is I can actually create custom resources. And so I'll log out of Safari here, and I'll move back over to Firefox to my super user. What I can do is I can create a custom resource. So returning to the security menu here and going to resources, I can see all of those resources in the system. So there's resources protecting the different pages in the management portal. There's different resources protecting the databases, and we also saw that there's a variety of resources protecting the services, which are the connections into the system. Okay. Now, there's all the ones that are there by default. We can see that some of them are marked as public. Right? So there's some public permissions on these. It's as if everybody had them in their role. So those are the resources. I can create a new one up in the top left. And I'm going to create one that I'm going to assign to the processes page so that my user cannot access the processes page. So I'm going to just call it proc page. I'm going to give it no public permissions. Just a second ago, I created a new one called proc page down at the very bottom. Now, a resource, just by looking at it, you have no idea what it protects. I could have given it a better description here or given it a more complete name. But a resource really is just a name. It's not doing anything until it's applied to an asset. So now if I return back to the home page of the management portal and go to the system operations page and go to the side menu of processes, I can see that processes is currently protected by admin operate. I can also assign a custom resource here, and I can find in my list of resources my proc page resource and add that. And now this page is protected by both admin operate and proc page. So it's an and, not an or. I need both admin operate and proc page. So now that that's been applied, if I return to Safari and log in as Shane, and I'm right in the system operations page here, I can see that I can still access the system dashboard and the console log and things like that I could before, but now processes is grayed out. I cannot see the processes. So I guess we'll do another poll question here. So if we could bring up the second poll question. And it's, have you customized access to pages in the management portal by creating custom resources? So do you know if you've done what I've just showed there, if you've gotten a finer granularity of access beyond just like admin operate, admin manage? Okay, so it looks like a lot of people have not. So maybe the default granularity of system operations versus system admin versus security parts of the portal is good enough, but maybe you'd be interested in locking down specific pages. Because, like, for example, the processes page, you have a lot of power when you're there. You could accidentally terminate something you don't mean to. So that's good. So maybe some people will consider that going forward. Okay. So now what I want to do is keep editing this role that I've created. So back to the roles page in the management portal, find my monitor role. So right now my user has access to Cache Sys, CSP connections, and the admin operates resource that protects system operations. Now, I also want to extend this to give my user some level of access to the Ensemble parts of the portal. So if I go look at the Ensemble menu, and I'm just going to deal with the ENS demo namespace. Ensemble, it's very similar to the pages I was looking at so far. So for example, if I wanted to see the messages, I would need a resource called %ENS message header and use on that. If I wanted to be able to see the production monitor, I would need ENS dashboard use. And then some of these also use read and write. So for example, if I go to configure in production, and once again, the production page is where you have the different components and you can edit the routes through the system. The production has this resource, ENS production config, and now unfortunately it's getting cut off on my screen here, but it actually uses read and write. So if you have read, you can go to the page and see everything. If you have read and write, you can actually make changes to the production. So what I'm going to do to start here is I have my monitor role. Shane is a member. Roles can also be assigned to other roles. So if I assign my monitor role to a role called %ENS role monitor, this means that now my monitor role that I created is now a member of this monitor role, meaning that any members of monitor get the privileges defined in monitor in addition to any roles that the role is assigned to. So if I look at ENS role monitor, that gives use on that dashboard and use on ENS portal, which is another important privilege. To be able to access any parts of the Ensemble portal, you need use on ENS portal. So now Shane is a member of Monitor. Monitor is a member of ENS role monitor. So Shane has all the privileges from both roles. Okay. So now that's a starting point, but if I return to my monitor role, I want to give a few more Ensemble privileges. So since this is a member of ENS role monitor, it has the dashboard, but I'm also going to give permissions on the production. So if I find ENS production config, and to start, I'm just going to give read access. So now Shane has these privileges and also the privileges that this monitor role is assigned to. So if I return to Safari here and log in as Shane, I can see various pages in Cache. However, when I click on Ensemble here, I see a blank page. And that's because I skipped one thing, which is that we also need the database. So I gave all those permissions to all those pages. However, you still also need to add the database that you're trying to access. So all the productions and monitoring data and things like that for that namespace live in the default database of ENS demo. So all those default roles for Ensemble, they only get you so far. You always have to at least consider the database that you're trying to access. Yep. So now if I come back and I go to the Ensemble page, I can see the ENS demo namespace. If I click on that, I can go to monitor, and I can see the pages that are protected by that dashboard. So I can see the production monitor, for example. I can also see the pages that were protected by the production config resource. I only had read, so I can go to this page. But if I tried to double click on one of these business services, it will tell me I don't have permissions to change the status of this item. If I go back and change that permission to be both read and write on production config, and return to the production and try to disable a component, I can actually do it. So it went gray, I disabled it, and I was able to do that because I had both read and write. And I can re-enable it. Now, logging out as the portal as Shane and coming back to my super user, the messages page is also a good one. I clicked off to the side of that a minute ago and showed that you need message header use, ENS message header use. That's just to be able to access the page. If I go in there, this page presents to you a table of the messages. So I need use on message header to be able to even access the page. However, on pages that use SQL to query a table to present you with information, you also need additional SQL privileges to be able to access that table. So the role-based schema, you can get even more granular with SQL tables and say which tables you can query and whether you have select, update, or insert permissions. So now if I go back to my role here and first give use on ENS message header, that'll give Shane access to the page, but as we'll see, when he tries to log in, he'll get a different error. He'll be able to access the page, but he's going to get this SQL error telling him that he's not privileged to query the table. Okay? So in addition to being able to having the resource that's protecting the page as a whole, I also need SQL privileges on the table of messages. So if I return back to my super user, when I'm looking at the monitor role, there's a tab for SQL tables. If I go there, I can see for the namespace ENS demo what tables we have. And right now, Shane actually has select privileges on the event log because of the monitor role that he's assigned to. Okay, so he already has a few SQL privileges that actually made it so I could look at the dashboard page earlier. But to make it so that he can also look at the messages, I can add a table here, and I have to say what schema the table is in. And it is in ENS, and the table is message header. So there's a table in the system called ENS message header, and I want to give select permissions on that table. And now this is telling me on this page here that I can select from the ENS message header. So Shane's a member of Monitor. Monitor has select privileges on the message header table. So returning to Safari here, if I go into the messages page, I now can actually see the messages. Now, I didn't give access to the message bodies or any of the visual trace. I only gave access to the message header table and those details. So Shane can see the table of message headers. He can look at the different message headers, but cannot see the actual contents of a message. Yep. So you would want to restrict who can actually see the contents of the messages because that could contain sensitive medical data. But maybe you want Shane to be able to do a few other operations in here, maybe being able to resend messages or at least be able to look at the visual trace. Right now, if I would try to click on the session and see the visual trace, I would get this access denied. If I try to resend a message, once again, access denied. There's several privileges or resources for Ensemble activities that have to do with the message viewer and things like that. So if I return to my user and add a new privilege, I can add ENS message trace and ENS message resend. Now, both of those need use. And that'll give Shane the ability to view the message trace and also be able to resend a message if necessary. Oh, I'm sorry, I actually didn't log in as the correct user there. Sorry, this is Shane. But once again, session works correctly and can resend a message. Now, there's a lot of Ensemble roles already in the system, and there's a lot of Ensemble resources and privileges. Just to point you in the right direction in the future, in the Ensemble documentation, there's a Managing Ensemble book that has a listing of a lot of what these default roles and privileges are and what SQL privileges are necessary to view different pieces in the portal. So hopefully once you've seen a couple examples here, those pieces of docs will help you make more sense of it. Now, there's other things that you might be interested in. I'm not going to go into all of them. But there's the data lookup tables, so it's pretty conceivable that you might want to have a user that just doesn't have access to much in the system, but being able to edit the lookup tables that you use in your routing rules or data transformations. So you might have some data entry person that can access that page, and that needs ENS lookup table. So remember, you can always click off to the side of a page and see what resources are required. The page may then require additional SQL resources. When you're building up your roles and you're testing this out with a user, typically just try to give one privilege at a time so that you're just seeing what base level of privileges are necessary to perform a set of activities, because you don't want to give users more than they need. So as you're setting up your security model, it might be a lot of trial and error of giving some test user some more privileges, some more levels of access until they can access something that a real user would actually need to see in the system. Yep. And now at this point, I have my role completed. My users of Monitor, they can get to the system operations page and see the dashboard and the console log and things like that, but not the processes page. They can get to the Ensemble part of the portal, do some activities with the production, and they can also see the messages and resend, but not look at the contents, and they can look at the production monitor to see how we're doing there. Now, once it's actually completed, we can have more users created and assigned to that role. So if I go to security and users, I could make another user, and we could have Michael join in on this and make a new user, Michael. And Michael could also be assigned to the Monitor role. If I look at Monitor, I can see that Monitor has members of Shane and Michael. Yep, so now Michael would be able to do all the same things as Shane, and any new members, any new users can just be assigned to that role, and you've only had to set up those privileges one time. Okay. Just one last topic I want to talk about here is a little bit about auditing. We talked about a lot of different activities that you can perform in the system here. It's important to keep track of who's doing what. So when we talk about database auditing, it's who did what, where, when in the system. Auditing can be handled under the security section. There's the auditing menu. You can first configure what system events you want to audit. So there's some pretty basic, some pretty straightforward ones like login and login failure. So who logged in? Did someone try to log in? When did they log out? There's some audit entries on exporting or importing data. We can keep track of who did that. We can also, there's some specific Ensemble ones for if somebody viewed the contents of a message, or if somebody made a configuration change or started and stopped a production, we can be auditing all of those entries. So just to show some of this, and I'll just stay as my sRows user here. If I go to Ensemble, configure, production, and if I make a change to any settings here in the production, so if I make a change to a call interval or restart a component, that will be audited. If I go to a message and view the contents of a message, that will be audited. So if I go back to security, auditing, and now view the audit database, I can see some of those activities that just happened. I can see that the user was sRows. I can see that he viewed the contents of a message. And I can see that he made a configuration change in the production. So if I click on the details of one of these audits, I can see that the user was sRows, and he made a change to the call interval, changing it from 5 to 6. I can also see that he viewed a message, and I can see the IDs of the messages that he viewed. And additionally, I could even see that Shane just looked at the audit table. That's also audited. Okay, so I think that's it for the demo. Okay, so to review here, we have users are members of roles granting permissions on resources protecting assets. Our various assets were just, first of all, being able to connect via the CSP service through the CSP gateway. But then beyond that, we locked down various management portal pages. You needed use on admin operate to get into the system operations part of the portal. In the Ensemble part of the portal, you needed use on the message header to see the messages, read on production config to look at the production. So there's a lot of resources built in to protect these pages in the portal. Don't forget that also you need the database. So to be able to see the operations pages, I needed cache sys. To be able to see the Ensemble pages for the namespace I was interested in, I needed ENS demo. A lot of the pre-built Ensemble roles won't have the databases included, so you have to extend those and add the databases at least. Okay. Once you've picked what resources protect what assets, you put privileges in the role, so you decide what permissions you should have, and then users are assigned to the role. Good. So that's it. Thank you all for listening. I guess we will turn it over to questions. So Michael's been compiling a list of questions for me.
Okay, yeah, so we got a couple good questions in here. So first, are there default read-write permissions for all of the databases? And along with that, can I make a database read-only? What's the best way to do that?
Okay, so a couple questions there and a couple answers. So for the databases, for each of the resources protecting the databases, like for example, ENS demo, there's this resource protecting that database. We automatically make a role that gives read-write access to that resource that you could add to your users. You could change that role. You can also, whenever you're giving this privilege to a role, you could just not include write. So when I added ENS demo and cache sys to the role, I could have left off the write privilege and made it just read only. However, that's only for that role. The other part of the question, is there a way to make a database read only all the time? And yes, the best way to do that would be to mount the database as read only. So for example, there's a system database called cachelib. Contains a variety of library utilities used to develop the cache applications. It's mounted as read-only, so nobody can write to it. So any of the databases can be mounted as read-only. And when I was looking at the system operations pages in the portal that I had admin operate with, there's the databases menu in there. That's where you can mount databases, and you could choose read-only. Okay, perfect. More questions?
Awesome, yeah. Regarding SQL use versus read permissions, is there a generic difference or a way to think about that?
So with the SQL privileges, it's not as much read and write there. You're giving the specific select, insert, update permissions on those privileges. So whenever I added the ENS message header table to the SQL permissions, I had to select that I had to choose that I had select permissions, but I could have put in update or insert. So you need at least select to be able to do anything on the to be able to see the table, but then you decide the writing with insert and update.
Okay, we have another great question here. You mentioned, Shane, that the custom resources on an item in the management portal was an and with the assigned resource. So, it already has the regular assigned resource, and then you also assign the custom resource. Is there a way or any thought of having an or capability?
So there is actually not. So you need always that base privilege of admin operate to be able to see those, and then from there on out it's an and. So to be able to get pretty granular with those pages, you'd have to make several resources to apply to each of the tables, and basically give most of your users admin operate, and then just pick and choose the resources from there on out. So unfortunately, no way to give or. It's always an and on those custom resources.
Okay, and just one more here, and I want to note we have a couple questions that we're not going to hand off to Shane for now. The way we'll answer those questions is either just directly in an email to you, where we can really elaborate in detail, or we'll include the answers to these questions on a developer community post that also links to this. So just hang in there if your questions aren't getting answered. It might just be too long of a question that I don't really feel is relevant for just everyone, even though it's really relevant for you. So we will get answers to you on those. Okay, so last question here. How far can I get with the out-of-the-box roles? Can I just edit those?
Oh, yes. So there's the out-of-the-box roles that we showed, like ENS monitor. ENS role monitor that I assigned my monitor role to. And now I mentioned earlier that you always need at least the database. Like that doesn't give you any of the databases for Ensemble. However, one thing, and this is very important to note, is that all of the Ensemble roles, like ENS role monitor, ENS role developer, they are reset upon an upgrade of the system. So if you upgrade Ensemble, those roles are reset. So actually don't edit those roles because you risk losing your changes upon an upgrade. What you should do is something similar to what I did. Make your own role, assign it to one of those default roles, and then extend it in your role. So I added like production config in the message header, but I extended the dashboard pieces of the monitor role. But I didn't want to edit that role directly because it gets reset on an upgrade. Okay. So thank you, Michael, for the questions. Those are good, and once again, we will get to the rest of them afterwards, either directly to you or on the developer community. So once again, thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing with us through some technical problems there. This is a new series that we're doing, these webinars, so we're still working on it. But any feedback that you can give us would be great, so please fill out the survey at the end here. Once again, we mentioned that the recording will be available. It will be available at learning.intersystems.com. It will also be a link in an email sent to you. And any additional questions that you come up with can be posted on the developer community post related to this webinar. So once again, I'm Shane Rose, and with me here was Michael Brady. Thanks for stopping by.